Hello. Welcome to Hood episode 35. Success lessons is still at Quizlet. I actually didn't know Quizlet uses Istio. James was a SIE for Istio at Quizlet.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was started as a senior SRE about 4 years ago and moved up to staff. And among other projects like moving from VM to Kubernetes and doing a lot of data overhaul, one of the larger projects I did there was introducing Istio to Quizlet. Why don't I go over? Would you like me to speak about like what Quizlet
Yeah,
is?
that's great. That's
Yeah.
great. Sorry, I heard an echo, so I had a pause
Oh,
moment. I
no
apologize
worries.
for that. So I am so excited to talk to you, James. So in this live stream, I'm so excited to talk to you about your job at Quizlet and also share with us why Istio and how was Istio adoption and the key lessons you learned along the way while adopting Istio at Quizlet. So I know you just gave a quick intro. So can you talk to us about what exactly is Quizlet for folks who are not familiar with the company?
So Quizlet started out over a decade ago from a fellow named Andrew Sutherland. It was his kind of project, and it started out as just a way to create and share flashcards. So if you're studying for a nursing exam or anything, anatomy or a lot of things that require memorization and use flashcards, it was a way of sharing your stack of flashcards with someone else, which is great because if you're all in the same textbook, maybe you want to help out your study buddy at school, you could share it. And it's evolved way past that. There's coordination with books and advanced kind of learning and more AI behind how questions are formed and built and how those stacks are made. But ultimately it is a user content driven site that houses flashcards and a lot of learning tools. At this point, the saturation is quite high. When I was there about 1 or 2 years in, I think we realized that in North America and Canada, literally every single high schooler either uses Quizlet or knows what it is.
Yeah.
So it is a very phenomenal market. When I was there for about 4 years, and during that time, there was about a 10x growth over those 4 years. So it's become a pretty big powerhouse. I've used it on my own to test for exams. The amount of use for it is phenomenal. Uh, I don't. Everyone's like, oh, it's just online quizzes or whatever. But like that's really useful. People, nurses. I remember when I was having my son, I wore one of the shirts, and I had like 3 different nurses come up and thank me for working on Quizlet. They liked
Oh,
it so much.
nice.
So
That
yeah,
must be a great feeling. Yeah.
yeah. Very large user base, very large amount of user created content. So yeah, and like I said, it's been around for 10 years. Very, very popular amongst people that are in school. So yeah.
That's awesome. I do have a high schooler. I'm going to ask him today whether he used Quizlet.
I would bet
So
my hind teeth that the answer is he either uses it or knows about it. Like it's
yeah,
very, very popular. Yeah.
yeah, awesome. So what was your role at Quizlet?
So as I kind of jumped the gun and mentioned, I started out as a staff SRE, as a senior SRE and became a staff SRE. The philosophy there was kind of like, hey, if you whatever you want to aspire to do here, go do it. So I really wanted to run small projects with small teams. Well, actually, really large projects with small teams is kind of what they became. So when I started, it was really about shoring up some of the things that need to be fixed, metrics and logging and some of our data stores. But then one of the bigger projects was moving from Kubernetes, from VMs, because running all VMs to Kubernetes. And I worked with a great team underneath the architecture direction of a guy named Amal Deshmukh from Twitter. And it was kind of a longer project and it was very difficult, but that got us to Kubernetes. And it's funny, everyone talks about, well, when do you go into a service mesh? It's like immediately after you figure out Kubernetes, you go to a service mesh. It's literally like the next. I can't imagine it not being the next step if you want to do a microservices architecture. So I had really early conversations about Istio, about Linkerd, about what a service mesh would mean to Quizlet, even before we had finished kind of moving to Kubernetes. And I had throughout the Kubernetes project, I did vertical outreach. So talking to the SVP to Miller and horizontal outreach. So like having these engineering wide meetings to try and get everyone on the same page. and then immediately kind of did the same thing with Istio. So yeah, that was my role there was SRE, so I had all the other fun stuff on call, figuring out optimization, performance checks and stuff like that, and along with running the projects as the person running the project plan and doing outreach as well as a core contributor. So
That's awesome because the SIE is one of the key personas we're targeting for service mesh
yeah,
and across the service mesh industry, right? It's not just for Istio. So that's really, really cool. So now I believe yesterday was your first day at Solo.
yeah.
So I'd like to kind of ask you, it sounds like you had an interesting career at Quizlet. What motivates you to join Solo?
So this is almost a pandering answer, but part of it is actually you. You sit, unless I'm wrong, you're on one of the seats of the TOC for Istio, right? You and
Yes, I
Yuval.
am.
So
Me and Niraj.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, two out of the 5 seats are at Istio. The other 2 are Google and IBM, right?
Yep.
By the end of this talk, you'll understand that I really loved working with Istio, and what better place to go to a place that's literally driving it, right? And there are some things I've very much learned about Istio that made me think a lot about someone is going to figure out a way to market this as a service in a better format than it's currently done. The kind of the lay of the land with Istio right now is if you wanted to pay someone to do it for you, for Quizlet, especially because they're GCP, you'd buy Anthos Service Mesh, right? And you'd be kind of locked into what they're building. And then other than that, there's kind of glue and kind of no one really that was fitting into the space for us, especially. So yeah, I mean, that was a big part of it. Was like, hey, this company does something I really have enjoyed working on. And then all the conversations I've had with everyone here has been really great. My philosophy for finding a job is right place, right time, right people. And every single step of the interview process, when everyone I've spoken to, and even after I've started, as I had mentioned previously, like it's gone very, very well. I really like everyone so far at Solo, so I don't think that'll change at all. So yeah, I've been very impressed. So yeah, it was like, yeah, this is a really great company to go work for. I was happy to get the opportunity.
That's great. I like what you said. Right place, right time, and right people, right?
Yeah.
Love it. All right. So let's dive into Istio at Quizlet. I can feel you have a lot to say already. So can you start with why is service mesh needed at Quizlet first?
Okay, so let me get some context and time, right? So like I said, I had discussions with our chief architect Amal about, hey, what do we want to do about, because we're moving to a microservices architecture. At the time, it's a monolith. We had very much run into Conway's law. We really needed to start breaking into microservices so we could start accelerating our engineering group, right? That was a big push behind it. And we had these early kind of talks about service mesh, but we were pretty far away from even having Kubernetes done at this point. And so we're like, we had talked about Istio, and this Istio would have been like in a 1.2, 1.3 era where they had Citadel, and a lot of it was like, that might be a little too much for us at this point, but we'll revisit it once we have
That was a
Kubernetes, right?
smart call, by the way.
I mean, right again, right time, right? So for us, we knew it was something we needed to think about because we were moving to a microservice architecture, and we needed to have insight and control over that, which is a big part of moving to that kind of architecture. And by the time we actually moved to Kubernetes, we had a core cluster that was running the monolith in a container, and we'd broken that apart into other smaller services, sidecar services, and then we had another cluster that was actually starting to run real dyed-in-the-wool actual microservices. And immediately after kind of getting everything linked up and Kubernetes was successful, we had good scaling, everything else was going pretty well for us. We realized like, hey, we don't have good insider control over the actual services underneath. And what had started happening is some services weren't responding quickly enough, or they were responding in a way that we didn't understand because we had no observability into it. And we had no control over it either. So if we needed to throttle it, or we had some other design, some other need for a breakoff point, we had nothing we could do that with. We just assumed they were going to work perfectly, and that is a terrible assumption. Any SRE worth their salt will say, no, you need to assume they're going to work poorly and then work backwards from there, right? And so at the time, after working on VM to Kubernetes, another group had started that was doing traffic management underneath security, underneath Boris Fedorlik. That was myself, Tarek Skeens, and Graham Trummel. And Tarek comes from a really heavy great networking background, so the two of us kind of conspired on what would it mean to use a service mesh, and we had a lot of these long conversations with them all about, hey, what do we really need here? And we identified some key things. And I think anybody who's looking at a service mesh, and this kind of is true for all projects, identify 2 or 3 things that you really want from it, and create some measurability around that. So for us, it was observability, the ability to control breakpoints at any point, and then in a weird way, repeatability about creating new services. So part of the problem we had was creating a new service was pretty onerous on the service owners, and then they couldn't see what was going on, right? So that's really difficult. I have an engineering background. I built stuff like this. I can imagine making a service and going, well, in my tests, it worked okay, but I don't even have a good test platform. So all right, well, we need to make that a much better experience for our service owners. And then we need, as SREs, we need to be able to see what our traffic is like and and we need to be able to control it as we need, right? So service mesh kind of does those 3 things very, very well. It does way more than that. There's encryption across the board. You can hook into IDC. There's all these other things that are really important about service mesh, but they weren't key to us to begin with. So we kind of started with those principles, and we started looking, okay, well, what's the lay of the land? What companies, what projects can provide this? And so we started looking at Istio, we looked at Linkerd, we looked at console mesh, and those are kind of the big 3 we looked at. There's others that we were looking at, but weren't super sure on. Ultimately, we picked Istio, not just because I feel, and I think Tarek would agree, that it's the most mature product, but it also had heavy tie-ins at Google. And if you're in GCP and one day you do want to move to Anthos Service Mesh, or you want to move to one of their products, well, they're running Istio, at least on one of their service meshes. They have a few. So you want to keep in lockstep with them, right? So you're not, if I built this out in Linkerd and I want to move to Anthos Service Mesh, I'd have to convert everything back to Istio.
Yeah.
Right? That would be
so was Quizlet primarily on Google Cloud at that point, or you have it spread on?
It's everything. So primarily Google. There's an AWS presence for a few things, but dwarfed by the GCP presence for sure.
I can understand with your audience serving like high schooler, probably security encryption was less a concern, I guess, with the platform, but more focused on, speed and agility and be able to gain visibility of what's going on.
So security was important to us, but it wasn't a key driving factor. We didn't, there are things that were left on the table by the end of the project that I wish we'd done better. But one of the things we did do that we didn't necessarily need to do right out the gate was we actually set up a whitelist to make sure our application only access things it was supposed to. We did set up MTLS for things like our Redis cache, things that weren't necessarily like, hey, this is top of mind priority, but it were like, hey, these are good, easy wins that we're going to get by doing this. So the security thing wasn't like the biggest thing in the world. So yeah, it was really more about, the biggest win easily was the observability. It was to be able to see, hey, what is the latency like from these services? When do we get these spikes? And the biggest thing is understanding where the origin of your issue is. So one of the things that Envoy does and Istio does as an extension is a great thing for any SRE is it tells you which end of the pipe is having a problem. If your service is going slow and it's an upstream issue, and you go to your service owner is going to sit there and scratch their head. And this happened to us. They're sitting there banging their heads on trying to figure out, why some of these connections are failing. It turns out it had nothing to do with them. It was the main application killing its connection during scale up and scale down. And without Istio, without that insight, we never would have seen it. So that was really great for us. And then the way
basically, it's important for you to figure out who to blame, right?
It wasn't about blame, but it was at least about where where the problem was, right? Like I think a big chunk of being an SRE is understanding systems and understanding where things go wrong, and understanding, we jokingly call it the 4 fundamental resources of computing, right? CPU, RAM, disk, and network, right? Well, network's a big part, and if that's failing, you need to know where is it failing, right? So that was a huge thing for us. And it really helped out our service owners because all of a sudden they actually had real production insight into what their services were doing.
That's great to hear. Yeah, so I like to draw attention to the first question we got from Candy. Not sure if I pronounced your name. Apologies if I didn't. Somehow I don't see a very good learning material for rate limiting in Istio. Would it be possible to share an enterprise architecture suggestion for Istio global rate limiting? So I wasn't sure if you are using rate limiting in your
We
previous
did it for
job
testing.
at
We didn't
Quizlet.
actually need it for anything we were doing. We ended up not having to limit things so much as debug them was really the major source of solution for a lot of this. I do recall there was some rate limiting testing we did through the Istio docs, but I cannot remember where. Sorry, that doesn't particularly answer your question well, but that just speaking from my experience, that wasn't something that was immediately needed by us.
So that's it. That's useful. So I guess from an Istio perspective, I'll try to chime in to answer your question too. So from an Istio perspective, I believe one of the challenges with the Istio project is the way rate limiting have. If you go to Istio.io right now, which I am, and if you search on rate limiting, right? So we actually have documentations on how to do rate limiting, but the challenging is, I believe, it doesn't have an official API. So I'm going to put a link in here on the guidance of using Istio. So feel free to go to that page. So essentially it shows how you could configure rate limiting with Envoy filter. The challenge is Envoy filter is not a mature API in Istio, and it could be changing from one release to another release. And it has had long upgrade issue in the past, which James, you probably run into if you ever use Envoy filter in Istio. So that's unfortunately the recommended solution in Istio with rate limiting. In Glue Mesh or Glue Edge Gateway, we do support rate limiting as a first citizen API if you're interested to explore that. So essentially you could do rate limiting as an official API, and you can just configure your rate limiting resource. So that might be something interesting to you. So please let us know if that answers your questions. Thank you so much for that question, Kadeep. Appreciate that. All right. With that, I'd like to ask you, James, what went well, right? So sounds like you talk about why service mesh, which starts with observability. You talk about why Istio, which is because a lot of you workload was running on Google Cloud, and Istio also was the most mature service mesh out there, which I completely agree. So can you talk us through, what went well as part of your journey with Istio at Quizlet?
Our cutover, Amal had the saying that he repeated and I often repeat, which is it's very easy to be 90% done and then have 90% to go. For us, we had kind of completed all the testing we needed. We did stress testing with Fortio. We actually built out a Fortio service for other people to stress test with as well. We had to answer a lot of questions around latency. The general rule of thumb was basically 2 milliseconds of latency per envoy, and that's kind of the upper bound of it. And then we had a lot of very real questions about reliability. You are essentially saying, hey, I need to have IstioD running in order to do releases, which is an interesting caveat that I think most people don't understand. Is you can kick over IstioD while it's running, and Istio, your traffic will still route. As long as Envoy is going. As soon as you deploy and you knock out your sidecars, you have a problem. But so it's not as though like your traffic is running through IstioD, so you've introduced yet another single point of failure. And the other parts where that can fail, like the ingress gateway, things like that, those are equivalent to the other single points of failure you already exist with. So any other gateway you're using, right?
Yeah.
So we had to answer a lot of those questions, and when we were confident with it, we were like, all right, well, how do we, what do we really want to do with cutting over? And so we started doing stress testing and all the services through Istio to make sure everything worked out correctly. And now that we had the observability, we could verify that, which was great. And we started cutting it over from one cluster to another. So that's kind of like we got it a little easy because that's like kind of a cheat in a way. if you're cutting from one cluster over to another, you're basically just routing traffic and saying, hey, instead of going to cluster A, go to cluster B. And we had introduced, correct DNS names for the new service, and we could see everything routing, and we pre-warmed them. So we actually cut over all of our services during peak traffic, basically 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Zero hiccups, not even noticeable. So, and that's a rare thing to kind of, I talk about it being the equivalent of moving or changing your tires on a moving car. Like it's generally you would not do that during peak time, but we were so confident in it, and we had so many ways of observing what was going on and control that we were fine with it. And then ultimately, I think within a week, we actually shut down the old cluster, and everything was running smoothly through Istio. And yeah, it worked out really phenomenally well. I think a lot of our several service owners came and thanked me personally, and I think a lot of our service owners were quite happy because it really made their life so much easier. And then from an SRE and traffic management perspective, it really gave us a lot of insight. So if you have an incident, for Quizlet, a lot of what they observed was the response. So the SLA was like, hey, we want to have 99.95 of our responses to be good, right? Which is about 15 minutes of downtime a month. It's a very hard target to get to. And so when you started seeing 500s at the application level, you're like, all right, well, why is that? And it was for a long time, it was very hard to determine if that was a downstream service or not. But now all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, we knew exactly when services were having problems. We knew exactly what kind of traffic caused it. We knew exactly if it was upstream or downstream. And so we I had mentioned we really wanted to get rate limiting in there, and we had the mechanism to do so, but we never actually needed it because the thing that we were going to rate limit on, we just fixed. It was like, we don't need a rate limit on a service if it's no longer a problem, right?
Yeah.
That was, I was like, I couldn't answer the rate limiting question very well. I was like, we didn't have to do it. It was something we knew how to do, but ultimately it was, fixing the underlying service is the best answer anyway. And being able to put a learning and a bunch of other observability around it and actually empower our service owner to take care of it is I think ultimately the absolute best answer you can have to that problem. So yeah, and that that got a lot of great things out of it. So those were all really great successes. Service owners were happy. From a traffic management perspective, we were quite happy. No real impact to customers, like none observable anyway. We didn't have anything pop up at all. And it was done. It's a weird thing.
That's great. So
okay, sorry. I started rambling.
Yeah, so that's great. No. I just want to make sure, we capture this because what you said was really, really interesting. You said within a week, right? You were able to move to Istio and transition your services to run them in Istio. So that's really impressive. And it's kind of a counter from what we heard from a lot of people on social media and talk about how hard it was to adopt Istio, how Linkedy was so much simpler. So, but for you, it actually went pretty well from what I heard within a short time.
Our POC phase and us understanding it was, I think that was a month or two, but the actual cutover, like the actual, hey, we're really doing this. Yeah. Very short amount of time. I will say that anybody who thinks that Istio is very complex, you're not wrong. You can do a lot. It would really behoove you. And the most powerful thing that we did was we sat down and went through all of the examples on the Istio documentation on all of the components, virtual services, and how all of that worked one by one by one. I think that took maybe a week or two at the most to do. And we just did them in a POC cluster. So we really understood them. They're phenomenal. I will not stop gushing about how good the documentation for Istio is. Hats off to everyone who works on that. You've done a fantastic job.
Yeah, that's me sometimes for some of the dogs too.
Here I am again. So yeah, I mean, that was a big part of it, was us, sitting down and going through those examples and having the confidence that we knew what we were getting into. And then some of it was, general SRE paranoia. Like we kicked over Istio-D to see what would happen over and over again. We saw that there was, the 2 millisecond, that number we brought up about having Envoy. Yeah, we tested it ourselves with Fortio. We didn't need to, but like sometimes it's nice to, dot your I's and cross your T's, right? So we did a lot to make ourselves feel good about cutting over to Istio, and then the actual cutover, it was really painless. And
that's awesome. Yeah,
I really don't like having extra infrastructure that we're paying for floating around. So getting rid of the old stuff was great.
Totally.
It was very quick.
Yeah, now I want to say hi to Bojan. He's actually currently upgrading Istio from version 112 to version 114. So good luck with that. Make sure you use revision. And can you talk about what versions were you using initially, and also talk about a little bit about upgrade? Because our audience apparently have
Yeah.
interest in that.
So we started in 1.8, and I think we ended in 1.10 when we were doing POC work to do multi-mesh. So a little more context. We had these two clusters. The Istio control plane existed in one and did not exist in the other. We wanted to make a multi-cluster HA environment, which we went through the POC process and had everything kind of written out. I had left the company shortly before that production work had started working. So I don't know where that ended up, but I could tell you what we learned and what we were doing. And that was in 110. And we did upgrade from 1.8 to 110. That's a small upgrade. I think the only thing that we were like called out on was the fact that actually Kubernetes API was upgrading, and we had stuff that was V1 beta 1 in the API, and that needed to be changed. But that is a very, very minor change. It's literally changing the header lines, nothing. So that was really painless. I mean, part of it was, and this goes into things that maybe don't go so great with Istio, is understanding the correct way to install Istio. It's changed now and it's better, but when we were doing 1.8, there was no official Helm repository. So there was just the one you could get from Git, and we had to kind of change that around. And we were very careful about only changing things in the values file as needed, making sure that the path to upgrading to a newer version was going to be as clear and easy as possible. It don't try and get off a deviated don't try and deviate from the path there. Try and keep everything in a place where, if you're turning on Jaeger, or if you're turning on other anything that like is your own CRD or any other kind of customization that you're doing, try and make it as out of the way of a future upgrade as possible. So that worked out real well for us. I don't know what it'd be like to go from 1.8 to 114 or 111 to 114. It's just like Kubernetes, right? A lot of stuff is rapidly changing. I will say that looking at Istio's kind of longer term support of older versions, I felt confident that we could kind of slow roll our updates, but it is toil. It is something I've mentioned in things that can potentially not go right. If you're at an organization that can't support Istio, like they don't have the actual resources in human terms to support Istio, it's going to be very difficult for you. It's got the same kind of pitfall that Kubernetes has to a degree, where the upgrade cycles are very fast. Keeping on top of it is difficult. It is, that's part of the SRE game, right? Like people ask me what it's like being an SRE, and I'm like, it's like going to college for the rest of your life because you're constantly studying something new, and that's just the way that kind of goes. That's part of, the part and parcel of the job. But if you don't have the resources to support Istio, you got to think long and hard about what value are you getting from it. Quizlet was at a point where it was very clear we could get great value from it, but it does take, someone has to keep their eye on it. Someone does need to maintain it. You do need to upgrade at a pace. And I would say, and this is anecdotally, not data driven, but the pace of upgrade for Istio was less than the pace that we were facing with Kubernetes. We were using GKE, and we followed the stable release branch. And so, yeah, it was, that's something we had to keep an eye on. I think all good project plans will involve understanding what the resource requirements are long term, and you have to make that assessment of, hey, are we going to be able to support this long term? What happens when this upgrades? How do we do that? And we had that, I think, fairly well understood.
Yeah. So were you guys using revision when you upgrade from 1.8 to 110? The reason I'm asking is Bongjam just made a comment. Unfortunately, he's not using revision. He's using in-place upgrade with rollout restart. So good luck with that. There may be some downtime.
That is actually exactly what we did. We had a rolling upgrade, basically. We didn't have a revision. This is a thing too. So for us, we were using Argo CD to apply Helm templates, and so Helm was the one that was applying the Istio templates and building Istio for us. Helm does not have any kind of hooks into Istio CTL. We had talked at length about actually kind of building our own container running Istio CTL to commit commands. We kind of found that might be too complex and had kind of some moving parts that we weren't comfortable with. So yeah, it is a kind of a concern. And one of the things that did not go well is it's hard to make the determination, and this is also true for Istio operator. What is the best way to install Istio for your company? I think that in another world, if Istio CTL had Argo CD implementation, or if we didn't
If
have
we
Argo CD.
support Helm,
What's that?
if we added support for Helm and make it official, like stable, would
Yeah,
that help?
in 1.8. It was real hard to make the decision. Like,
Yeah.
well, because at the time there was Istio CTL, which seemed to be it has a lot of great features, and you should understand what Istio CTL does for multiple reasons, and not the least of which is diagnosing things. But and revision is another one, obviously. But then there was also Helm, and now there's an official repo you can pull down from. But it doesn't seem.
Yep.
And that seems to be the direction I think Istio may be going, and you can correct me because you would know if that's where.
Yeah. Yeah,
What's
we're trying to promote the Helm support in Istio to beta. In fact, Daniel on my team at Solo have contributed a bunch of tests in Istio upstream. So if you go to Istio.io, you look at the Helm install, you look at the Helm upgrade test, those are all automated. So that gives a good foundation of stability of the Helm.
That's fantastic news, because that was a kind of ongoing concern with ours, because it seemed like Anthos service mesh also relied on Istio CTL commands, and we're like, okay, well, if we move there, we have to think about what does that mean? How are we going to do that? And then there was Istio operator, and from an SRE perspective, I like operators. That is a personal opinion. They're not always the greatest. Kind of, it depends on what the operator is doing and how it's built. But I like the idea of having an operator that handles your installation and controls it was really attractive. And there was an Istio operator, but it seemed like there was some warning flags, like kind of steer away from this. And we close to heart, fortunately, because it seems like it's maybe not the route to go.
Very unfortunately, due to lack of maintenance, it's now currently put on to discourage to use.
Good. I love operators, but I was glad it was clear. Like, there's nothing worse than installing something and being like, oh, well, that was actually abandoned 6 months ago. I'm glad it's very clear that's not a supported project. And ultimately, running Helm, that's for us at Quizlet. It was that was how we're doing everything else anyway. So that wasn't a big deal. It's not like we came from like customize to moving on to Helm. It's like this was something we're very used to. And once Helm 3 came out, I think Helm 3 was when they stopped using the tiller. Yeah, I was like, all right, bye bye anything else other than Helm, right? No more customized. So I'm glad to hear that that's becoming more and more clear. And yes, plus one to using Helm is the main
That's good to hear.
main way of installation.
Yeah, I think that's what the community is going. By the way, we just heard from Bojan. He's also a big fan of Istio operator, and he's still using it today. When he does the in-place upgrade from 112 to 114, it's 30 seconds downtime. So I guess not bad if you plan it well at the right timing.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. It's like, okay, so you knock over Istio D, you basically lock your deploys, you knock over Istio D, you upgrade that, and then you redeploy, and as long as your Envoy proxies can speak to everything, which they should be able to, that's pretty painless. I mean, there's a lot worse ways of upgrading things.
Yeah, exactly. Now there's a new question coming. Will the Istio operator be deprecated? That's a really good question. There's a reason we haven't called it deprecated, because we do intend to have it for a long time. We don't encourage new user to use it because there are Helm, there are Istio Cuddle, so we would prefer new user using those. But for existing users like you're already using Istio operator, so you can continue to use Istio operator. My understanding is Istio operator have some issues with the way revision is supported, and we didn't have enough people in the community willing to fix those bugs, particularly related to Istio operator with revision. So if you're just doing in-place upgrade, it's probably it's going to be what's very much less chance you run into issues, because that's been very well tested for a very long time. If that makes sense. Good questions. All right. I think we've been chatting about what went well. I think you kind of talk about what could have done better, any particular lessons you learned. I want to ask, if there's anything special you want to highlight as part of your learning journey of adopting Istio at Quizlet.
Um, I think it's important to understand, and I mentioned this earlier, but um, it really is kind of the answer to the question of, okay, well, I have Kubernetes, now what? Like to me, and part of the reason why I was stoked to come work for Solo is I think Istio and service meshes are going to be just every bit as important to the industry and its infrastructure as Kubernetes is as time goes on. Um, microservices and the services architecture are not going anywhere. They fit within Conway's law from an organizational perspective. They're very smart. And the larger company you have, especially when you get to a growth stage that you really want to scale up, it's kind of what you tend to have to do. I mean, there's other things like serverless, et cetera, et cetera. But even with that, like that fits in with having to be able to understand and control your mesh. Um, I will say that there was a lot of like especially high points of joy working with Istio. I think when we fired up Kiali and saw all the little ants going to all of our services, both Tarek Skeens and I, our face lit up because it's such a dumb like nerd hacker thing. But I'm like, oh my god, you can see the ants move everywhere. Like I was very, very, very excited about that. It felt very good. It was like it's one of those first times where it's like, oh, I picture a lot of things in my head about how things are hooked together, but to see it mapped out and actually know that you have insight and control over that, like that was very, very strong to me. It was a very good feeling, to say the least. I would say that I think the other kind of real great thing about Istio, as I mentioned before, was also the documentation. Coming from a GCP world where some of the documentation is very terse and hard to get through, it's also been phenomenal. And there's also so many things to come with it. In the background of this, actually, I think that's the Cilium logo up in the upper corner there, or maybe it's not. But there's Cilium eBPF integration into this. There's
Yeah,
ongoing changes to ongoing changes to Envoy. Like there's a lot of great things to come with service mesh in general. I think it's a technology that has great legs and will keep going forward. I've anybody who asks me what technology should I look into the next few years, and I was like service mesh, and then usually specifically Istio. Because I do feel like it is the most mature of the offerings right now. I
that's
obviously
great.
agree.
Oh yeah, we could never have enough fan of Istio. Yeah, I mean, what you were describing is actually the vision we have of Istio, where we want Istio to be part of the infrastructure, right? So people would be running transparent mesh where they don't even have to realize the mesh is there. And what you were describing about the ants on the diagram, right? That's exactly what we want you to have as a user, that you don't have to do anything. By injecting the sidecar, somehow you add your application to the mesh, then you instantly gain these observability, which is really, really powerful.
I will also say if you were scared of Istio because you looked at it 3 years ago or 2 years ago or however long ago, give it a revisit. That was a thing that I was like, when we looked at it, it's like, oh, this is going to be a lot for us. And with again, this goes back to understanding your organization. If you only have so many people that work on this, if you only have 4 or 5 SREs and they're already completely taxed keeping things going, you're probably going to have a hard time running Istio. Maybe look at solo.io for a product, or anyone else. I'm not going to try and pitch our own product, right? But
Yeah.
for sure, understanding what the organizational requirements are. I will say also, I do feel like, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but somewhat data driven, the requirements to actually running Istio from a human perspective are lessened now. It's gotten a lot easier, and the support is much higher. And again, like it's like any technology, as more and more people adopt it and the zeitgeist gets behind it, the more brains you have behind it, the easier it is to work with, the more questions get
Yeah.
answered that you can find on Stack Overflow or in the documentation or on solo.io or wherever else. Like all of that gets easier and easier and easier. So yeah, it don't be scared of it by any means. It'll make your life a lot easier. Certainly that's how I felt about it.
That's great. I think that summarized really well of for what I seen in the Istio community. A lot of users kind of give Istio a try very early on, like before 1.5. They run into bugs. Maybe the documentation wasn't very clear. They didn't get sufficient help, right? And then they gave up. But as you said, the community has put a lot of focus on making the doc really easy to consume and also make the product more mature by fixing a lot of bugs we heard from our user. So the the product definitely, involves as far as maturity and the usability. So definitely plus one, yeah, give yourself a try of Istio if it's new to you. And Solo is here to help along with your adoption journey of Istio Service Mesh. All right, Bonja, I couldn't quite understand your question, so I didn't quite understand what you were trying to sign up for. Migration will be paying. I understood. Yeah, so there's no plan to deprecate Istio operator if that's what you were concerned, right? We discourage new user to use it, but there's no plan to deprecate the existing users. And Rohit, thank you so much for saying hi. Appreciate that. Thanks for joining us. Is there anything else you want to highlight or add as we wrap up the session, James?
No, I mean, other than I'm really stoked on the space in general. Like I'm really excited about working on service mesh stuff. Like it was I interviewed at a few places and that was kind of, I think every interview asked like, what are you guys doing with the service mesh? And surprisingly, most companies actually had an answer. And some of it was, hey, we're looking into it. And some of it was, we've got one. And sometimes it was, you tell us. But I think that from just an SRE skill set standpoint, understanding what service meshes do and understanding, any of them, but I think especially Istio is nothing but a good idea for you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, now we got clarification. Where do I sign up for help with Istio operator? So certainly you can go to the community for help. You can also go to solo.io for help. We provide enterprise support for Istio, so that might be useful to you. And there are also other vendors in the community who provide support, but I definitely recommend Solo, so you can talk to us about any issues you have in Istio Operator. We're also using Istio Operator in our product as well. So yeah, with that, James, I am so happy we had the conversation. It's just interesting to hear your journey about adopting Istio at Quizlet. Started with observability, how your rollout story goes, and it went smoothly, and how excited you were to see the observability dashboard and be able to talk to specific service owner when things goes wrong. So that's totally amazing, and it's definitely one of the scenario we intended people to use in Istio. So really, really excited that went very well at Quizlet, and I'm very look forward to work with you also at Solo. So I want to take a moment to thank you so much for your time, and also thanks everyone for joining us on this live stream. Really appreciate all the questions you guys send in. So if you guys find this interesting, give us a thumbs up and also subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our future educations. Istio, Envoy, eBPF, GraphQL, and Cilium. And I'll see you guys next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.